All right, so I'll read this little thing. It's called Reinventing Critical Theory. The Reinventing Critical Theory series published cutting-edge works and seeks to reinvent critical social theory for the 21st century. It serves as a platform for new research and critical philosophy that examines the political, social, and historical, anthropological, psychological, technological, religious, aesthetics, and/or economic dynamics shaped the contemporary situation. Books in this series provide alternative accounts and points of view regarding the development of critical social theory. Put critical theory in dialogue with the intellectual traditions around the world and/or advance new radical forms of pluralistic critical theory that contest the congruent hegemonic order. Okay, that's just a brief thing. All right, so let's go to the acknowledgement. I don't know if I'm going to go acknowledgement. Okay. I'd like to correct for senior to. All right. All right, I can read the acknowledgement, I guess. It's only a paragraph. I'd first like to express my sincere gratitude to all of those at Sierra Nova and the Fanduccio Amical Cabral, who kindly assisted me in this project. I express my deep gratitude to Raylan Rabaka for his contributions to this volume. His continual words of support and encouragement of his profound engagement with Cabral's critical and political theory. Much of the present work is inspired by his various contributions. Special thanks to Carlos Rez, okay, these are other people, and all of those who helped in translating a number of terms. This book would also, okay, so this is, okay, they're just saying thank you. Okay, let's move on. Part 1. Amical Cabral and I keep saying critical race theory. Critical theory, introduction, investigation, and interpretations. Right. Chapter 1. Weapon of critical theory, Amical Cabral, Cabralism, and Africana critical theory. Okay, now forgive me for mispronouncing names and people's names and also places in Africa, because that was one of my problems, is how to pronounce these things. Okay, so Cape Verdean, Bissau Guinean revolutionary Amical Lopez de Costa Cabral connects with contributions to the African tradition of critical theory in several poignant, provocative, and extremely profound ways. First, it should be mentioned that, quote, although he did not start out or train as a philosopher, Cabral, according to the Nigerian philosopher Olufien Tawan, 1999, bequeathed to us a body of writings containing his reflections on such issues as the nature and course of social transformation, human nature, history, violence, oppression, and liberation. Second, and as eloquent argued by the Eritrean philosopher Tunisian, Sarah Quenberhan, 1991, Cabral's idea led to action, i.e. actual cultural, historical, social, and political transformation, and ultimately revolutionary decolonization, revolutionary re-Africanization, and national liberation. And therefore, present in the zenith of 20th century, African revolutionary theory and praxis. Third, and finally, Cabral's writing and reflection provides us with a series of unique contributions to radical politics and critical social theory, which W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Claudia Jones, George Padmore, Jean Price Mars, Leon Gontran Damas, Amin César, Leopold Singler, Louise Thompson Patterson, Frantz Fanon, Malcolm X, Elliot Baker, Stokely Carmichael, Angelus Davis, Walter Rodney, and the Black Panther Party, and the Cohabine River Collective, among others, seeks to simultaneously critique the incessantly overlapping, interlocking, and intersecting nature of racism, sexism, capitalism, and colonialism in contemporary society. Cabral's biography has been ably documented by Mario D. Andretti in 1980, Patrick Chabot 2003, Reynold Chillicote 1991, Mustafa Dia 1993, Olgay Ignatieff 1995, 1990, oh my gosh, and Jock McCulch 1983, consequently need not be rehashed in its entirety here. That being said, here at the outset of resistance and decolonization, what I am specifically interested in are those aspects of his life and legacy that impacted and influenced his contributions to the African tradition of critical theory. As Patrick Chabot observed in his pioneer Amilcar Cabral Revolutionary Leadership and People's War 2003, Cabral's revolutionary theory and practice are virtually incomprehensible without critical engagement. His gradual and often extremely interesting growth from nonviolent student militant and internationally acclaimed revolutionary leader. Here I have been tasked with introducing Cabral and his key contributions to the African tradition and critical theory. Here in the chapter to follow, Dan Wood will contextualize and critically engage the two works, analysis of a few types of resistance and, quote, the role of cultural and in the struggle of for independence, which constitutes a conceptual core, a raison d'etre and resistance and decolonization. Yo, what's up? Cabral, his background and humble beginnings, the ethical and intellectual formation of the future revolutionary. Cabral was born in Cape Verdine, parents in Bufata, Guinea-Bissau, on 12 September 1924. You can tell it's been translated to like English because the 12 September 1924. Usually we do it September 12th. Yeah. His parents exerted an enormous influence on him. His father, Juvenal Antonio de Costa Cabral, was born in Sao Tango Island, Cape Verde. Cabral Sr.'s family was primarily made up of landowners and therefore considered well-to-do, quote-unquote, by local socioeconomic standards. As a result, he was afforded a proper education, as with the other members of his family. Chabot, 2003, Juvenal Cabral had earlier ambitions to become a priest, and as a consequence was sent to seminary in Portugal following a glowing stint in secondary school. It is not clear whether Juvenal's study in Juvenal's study in Portugal awakened his sense of anti-colonialism and Africanity, or rather it was the racial climate and rigid religious circumcum of seminary, curriculum of seminary. However, what is certain is that he became a politically conscious man who did not hesitate to speak his mind. For instance, on one occasion, he sent letter to the minister of colonies, deploring what he understood to be the complete absence of government assistance and alleviating the catastrophic effects of drought, going so far as to suggest several remedies. Juvenal's environmental interest and critique of environmental racism should be noted, as they seem to have been handed down to his precious son Amilcar, who, as Wood's subsequent chapter strongly stressed, was, quote, deeply moved by Cape Verdine droughts and massive toll taken on lumpen proletarianized and racialized lives. In fact, Wood ultimately argues that Cabral was, quote, always quick to point out that the devastation caused by these droughts was not merely natural in any simplistic sense, but largely a result of colonial policies, end quote. On another occasion, Juvenal wrote an article expressing his disdain with the colonial government after a house collapsed in a overcrowded part of Para, in the capital of Cape Verde. He went further to criticize the inhuman conditions in which Cape Verdeans had to live because they were forced to flee the countryside and come to the already overcrowded cities in search of food, shelter, and work. Chenabal persuasively argued that it was Amilcar Cabral's father who gave him his first lessons in political education, a point further corroborated by Mustafa Dihade, 1993. Juneville Cabral also instilled in Amilcar a profound sense of a shared heritage and struggle of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. He wrote poetry, polemics, and expressed an uncommon and long-lasting interest in the agriculture problems of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. Juvenal, it sounds like juvenile, but I don't think it's said like that, ultimately becoming a renowned and well-respected schoolteacher, possessed a deep sense of intellectual curiosity and rigor, a respect for academic pursuits, and for the written word, which he constantly stressed to Amilcar and his siblings. While it cannot be said that Juvenal Cabral was a revolutionary nationalist by any measure, it does seem clear that he may have planted, however nascent, the seeds of nationalism in the fertile soil of his young son, heart and mind. It is, as it was with his father, Cabral's mother, Ivy Pinhole Avoria, was born in Sao Tego Island, Cape Verde. However, unlike his father, she was born into a poor family, a family that strongly stressed hard work and piety. If Cabral's father bequeathed to him political education, a love of poetry, and an interest in agriculture, then it can be argued that his mother provided him with a very special sense of self-determination, discipline, proposed personal ethics, and an unshakable iron will. For a time, Miss Cabral made a good living and was a entrepreneur, a proprietor of a shop and a small boarding house. When Avia and Juvenal Cabral separated in 1929, this took a turn for the worse financially. She lost her business and worked as a seamstress and laborer in the fish cannery factory to support her family. Even still, her earnings were, quote, barely sufficient to feed the family, and there were days when they went without food. Chumbal poignantly observed that although Amilcar's family did not starve like so many Cape Verdeans, they were very poor. He went on to importantly emphasize Cabral never forgot the difficulties of his earlier years, and later spoke of poverty as one of the reasons which led him to revolt against Portuguese colonialism. The hardship he witnessed his mother endure and overcome while caring for him and his siblings undoubtedly influenced Cabral's views on gender justice and, most especially, women as cultural workers and bona fide revolutionary comrades in the national liberation struggle. Cabral and the Cabo Verdinandade Momento, from innocuous anti-colonial student activists to revolutionary democratic socialist African nationalism. In discussing Cabral's earlier life, and especially the influence of his parents on the evolution of his thought, it is also important to point out that that he was homeschooled until the age of 12. Although he did not enter primary school until he was 12, Cabral was reported to have, quote, thrived on education, and from the very beginning, he was clearly an excellent student, end quote. One of his former primary school classmates, Manuel Lehmann de Alameda, recalled that Cabral was, quote, by far the best student that he passed his secondary school entrance exams with distinction. His school record supported Alameda's claim, and lucidity illustrates that Cabral completed his studies at the LaSalle by the age of 20, which would mean that he finished 4 years of primary school and 7 years of secondary school in an astonishing 8 years. During the last couple of years, his studies at the LISEU, Cabral became aware of the Cape Verdean literary resistance and culture movement, commonly known as the Cabo Verdeandian Movimento, the Cape Verdeanist movement, which was primarily an outgrowth of the journal Clarity. In many senses, the Cabo Verdeandian Movimento was the Cape Verdean and Lussophone version of the Harlem Resistance, Negritude movement, and oh my gosh, I don't know if I can say that, Negrismo movement, each of which significantly influenced the Cabo Verdeandian writers. That's a hard word to pronounce. I'm not even pronouncing it correctly. It's Verdiandade. Cabo Verdeandian was unique in that its writers, for the most part, broke with Eurocentric models and themes, and in a move that must be understood to be extremely bold for the time, turning their attention to Cape Verdean subjects, particularly ordinary people's life worlds and life struggles, from drought to hunger, from migration to mild critiques of colonial miseducation, and from starvation to other forms of deprivation. Even so, more similar to the Negritude movement than the Harlem Resistance, Cabo Verdeandian was limited by its intentional aims at readers well versed in colonial history and culture, and to make matters worse, it was essentially escapist, expressing an intense cultural alienation, what did not in way promote anti-colonial consciousness or decolonization, nonviolent or otherwise. Much like the earlier issues of the, can't say that word, Atit or Negritude Present Africani, then Cabo Verdeandian's Claridide explored ethnic, racial, and cultural politics in a vacuum, as opposed to connecting the intersections of political economy and ethnicity, racism, and colonialism with the machines? Wait. The machine shuns. Huh?
Mechanisms?
No, because it has a T-I-O-N. Mechanation. That's what it is. Of modern capitalist and class struggle. The first generations of Cabo Verdeandidae, can't say it, writers established their journal, Claridade, in the 1930s, but by the 1940s, a new cohort of Cape Verdean writers found the journal, Carteza. The Carteza writers introduced two elements into Cape Verdean consciousness that foreshadowed the future emphasis on national liberation, national culture, and national identity. The first element involved their unapologetic calling into question of Portuguese colonialism in Cape Verde and an unswavering emphasis on the necessities for political action, although not necessarily decolonization as later convinced by Cabral and his revolutionary nationalist comrades for the Cartesians Marxista writers. Marxism, rather than neo-realism, provided their theoretical framework and political orientation. The second element connected to several ways to the first revolved around this group's stress on returning Cape Verdean to the source of their history, culture, and struggle, Africa. As we have witnessed with the writers of the Cabo Vendendade Movimento, at this time, most Cape Verdeans understood themselves to be Europeans, Portuguese, and in particular, in the Cape Verdean archipelago, to be Portugal's most prized overseas island. I can't say that word. E la Horario Barreto, whom Cabral and would discuss in greater detail in the chapters to follow. The Carteza writers went beyond the Caradidae collective by unequivocally emphasizing their African ancestry and long-standing connections with continental African history, culture, and struggle, and Guinea-Bissau's history, culture, and struggle in particular. Ironically, Cabral had completed his studies and had left Cape Verde by the time this new movement was underway. Nevertheless, he eagerly kept track of it from abroad and noted that it had the potential to lead an anti-colonial consciousness and an openness of nationalists, if not bi-nationalist ideas. In the autumn of 1945, at the age of 21, Cabral trekked to Portugal to pursue a 5-year course of study at the Instituto de Agronomia de Universidad. Sorry, it's all different words. Here it is. The Origami Institute at the Technical University of Lisbon. He attached university on a scholarship provided by Cape Verdean branch of the Casa dos Estudantes de Imperial CEI, the House of Students from the Empire. A colonial government financed social development centers for students from Portugal's colonies. His scholarship remitted his tuition and supplied him with a very modest stipend of 50 escados. Those are like dollars, but in their terms, which was later increased to 750 escados. His meager stipend, of course, was not enough to live on. So Cabral toured and took various odd jobs, to supplement his income, all the while consistently maintaining the high marks of his cohorts. Even in light of all this, Cabral found the time to participate in university affairs, metropolitan politics, and on sundry extracurricular activities, most notable the Radio Club de Cabo Verde, the Radio Club of Cape Verde, and the CNPD, the National Commission of the Defense of Peace, Lisbon Maritime Center, an African House, the Center of African Studies, Momento Anticolonialist, MAC, the Anti-Colonial Movement, the CLTASDP, the Committee of Liberation of Territories under Portugal's domination, among others. Indeed, Cabral was a multi-dimensional student activist, although an extremely cautious one. For instance, Mustafa Dihadi, 1993, contended that Cabral may have, quote, stayed clear of subversive politics, largely for cautionary reasons, perhaps for fear of losing his scholarship, of being hounded by the Portuguese secret police, Policia Intercolonial, the international police of the defense of the state, and the very same secret police who would 2 decades after he earns his degree in agriculture engineering mercilessly orchestrated Cabral's assassination. Perhaps Cabral sensed sensed his imminent failure, future fate, but even still harassed and hounded by the Portuguese secret police, he managed to graduate at the top of his class on 27 March 1952. It was a real feat, especially considering the fact that he was the only student of African origins in his cohort. Out of the 220 students who began a rigorous 5-year course of study with Cabral's, only 22 were awarded degrees as ergonomists, or rather, cultural engineers. One of the students with whom Cabral developed a lasting rapport was Maria Helen Rodriguez, a silviculturist. Don't know what that word means. We're gonna look it up.
It's right after it. A tree specialist. It's a tree specialist.
VICULT. Oh, it's an I. What am I doing?
A silviculturalist.
Special forestry, dedicated to the science and art of controlling and establishing growth, health, and composition of forests. I need to hear what it says. No, don't you dare. Why is it? Of course, now I have to watch a stupid video. A dang video, sorry, my fault. Ooh, what? Civic culturist. Okay. Okay. I.e. tree specialist. Who was... Oh my gosh, I closed you. Who was born in Chaves, northern Portugal. One of only 20 women admitted in Cabral's initial cohort of 220 students. Rodriguez became Cabral's study partner, and after they earned their degrees, his wife. With his studies completed and a new wife by his side, Cabral applied for a position in the Portuguese civil service and was ranked as the best candidate, according to Chabot. But the 2003, but quote, was denied the post because he was black. This insult served as yet another reminder that Portuguese colonialism was inextricably from Portuguese racism. Cabral then did what so many colonial subjects are forced to do when their dreams of escaping the hardship of their colonized homelands have been dashed. And it's the triumvirate of negritude movement, Damas Césaire and Senghor. He returned to his native land convinced that he could make a special contribution to its development. In a word, he was doggedly determined to decolonize Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. Cabral gained employment as a quote, grade 2 ergonomist, ergonomist. I can't say the damn word. With the Provincial Department of Agriculture and Forestry Services in Guinea at the Escatco Algeria Experimental de Posebo, a research complex, but not far from Bissau. He was second in command and, from all the reports, seemed to have thrown himself into the Lisbon-based Ministry for Overseas Territories, commissioned agriculture census of Guinea-Bissau. It was through this massive undertaking that Cabral began, ultimately familiar with the people and land in whose interest he would soon wage a protracted people's war for national liberation. He began the studies in late 1953, traveling more than 60,000 kilometers and collecting data from approximately 2,248 peasants. By December 1954, he presented his and his team's findings to the colonial authorities. The report was subsequently published in 1956 as a 200-page document and featured statistics and analysis pertaining to Guinea-Bissau's agricultural demography, which the colonial government promised the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization it would use to better grapple with droughts and famine, among the other issues besetting Guinea-Bissau. Cabral was afforded considerable expertise carrying out the agricultural census. In fact, Cabral went so far to contend, quote, a few 20th century revolutionaries and guerrilla leaders were in the invaluable position to having such a specialized and detailed knowledge of the country in which they purposed to launch a people's war. Along with his work for the colonial government, Cabral made many political contacts with, tellingly, both Cape Verdeans and Bissau Guineans. Many initial outright rejected his ideas on decolonization, but after inaccessibly yet discursively provided examples, often empirical and refutable evidence, i.e., disenfranchisement, deprivation, starvation, lack of education, and violent government repression. And typically, over the prolonged period of time, i.e., usually several weeks or months, they were persuaded to seriously contemplate radical political alternatives and serious-minded solutions to the problems of Portuguese colonialism and European imperialism, more broadly speaking. It is here that Cabral excelled in time clandestinely making contacts with civil servants and entrepreneurs, as well as urban workers, peasants, and rural villagers. Emphasis needs to be placed on the fact that initially Cabral was open to using every available legal means to bring about the end to Portuguese colonialism. To this end, in 1954, he formed a sports, recreational, and cultural club for local youngsters, with the ultimate aim of using it as a front to promote nationalism, political education, and anti-colonial consciousness raising, as had been successfully done in British and French Africa. For instance, after a game of football, Cabral and his colleagues would retire to a more private place, supposedly to discuss how each player could improve their skills. On the contrary, the discussion centered on neither athletics nor other leisure activities. What really took place were intense and eye-opening conversations about African history, culture, and struggle, and the nefarious nature of Portuguese colonialism and racism. The club and its secret meetings gained considerable notoriety in and around Bissau, and as a result were insidiously infiltrated by the Portuguese secret police, informers, and swiftly terminated on government orders. Consequently, Cabral was forced to leave Guinea-Bissau and was permanently banned from residing in his homeland again. His petition for and was eventually granted annual visits to briefly see his mother and other family members during holidays. At this point, the die was cast, and Cabral let go of any lingering hope that Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau could be liberated using the constitutional and legal decolonization path. Ghana, Guinea, Nigeria, Mali, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, etc. It was therefore on one of his colonial government-sanctioned visits to Guinea-Bissau on 19 September 1956 that Luis Cabral, his brother, Astrides, Pera, Fernando Fortes, Julio de Alameda, and Acilio Turpin founded the Partido Africano del Independencia. I can't say, it's all in different language. The PAIUPGC, the African Party for the Independence of Unity of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Later, the name was slightly altered to the African Party of Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Over the next 17 years of his turbulent life, Amilcar Cabral would not only bring Portuguese colonialism to its knees and lead the people of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde through the decolonization to national liberation, but he would also reconstruct and redefine what it means to be a revolutionary nationalist and a revolutionary humanist. Although there were many who argued that Cabral was not necessarily a theorist, but more a guerrilla leader, a military strategist whose work is confined to national liberation struggles of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. Much like my volume, Concepts of Cabral, Resistance and Decolonization, ambiguously challenges these assertions and illustrates several of the ways in which Cabral's organic intellectual, quote-unquote, life and political legacy continue to contribute to radical politics, critical social theory, and revolutionary practice in general, and the Africana tradition of critical theory in particular. Who's in the theme? No one. Just says it. Okay. The social movement, 1768 to 2004, noted political sociologist Charles Tilly initially argued that social movements are most often made up of ordinary people rather than members of a politically powerful or intellectual elite. And it is these, quote, ordinary people, these organic intellectuals, a la Antonio Gramsci, provocative work in his prison notebooks, who collectively think, act, and speak in the best interest of and in concert with everyday average people and so-called masses. Gramsci famously contended that all men are intellectuals, but, quote, not all men have in society the function of intellectuals. It is extremely important to emphasize this point, because neither the African masses nor the squalid shacks and shanty towns they have been callously quarantined to have been recognized for their intellectual activities and positive social, political, and cultural contributions. Although, quote, one can speak of intellectuals, Gramsci declared, one cannot speak of non-intellectuals because non-intellectuals do not exist. In point of fact, there is no human activity from which every form of intellectual participation can be excluded. Homo faber cannot be separated from Homo sapiens, which is to say that, quote, the P-word man, Homo faber, cannot be completely divorced from the evolution of much vaunted wise man or civilized man, Homo sapien. Intellectuals do not simply inhabit college campuses and highbrow cafes. They can also be found in each and every country in Africa, including the village, slums, ghettos, and shanty towns. Right along with men of taste, Gramsci included philosophers in his conception of organic intellectuals, contending each man finally outside the professional activity carries on some form of intellectual activity. That is, he is a philosopher, an artist, a man of taste, a participant. He participates in a particular conception of the world as his conscious line of moral conduct, and therefore contributes to sustain a conception of the world or to modify it. That is, to bring it into being new modes of thought. African critical theorists, and Amilcar Cabral in particular, may not be understood to be, quote, a philosopher in Eurocentric sense of the term, but no mistake should be made about it. The Africana tradition of critical theory of traditional predicated on the pronouncement and practice of continental diasporan African organic intellectuals is undeniably philosophical in that it articulates and actively helps to bring into being a new conception of the world and a new modes of thought, free from Eurocentrism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, colonialism, and capitalism, as well as other forms of modern and postmodern fascism and imperialism. Any questions? Hey, what's up, Bree? All right. Conceptions of Cabralism, the 5 stages of Cabral studies. My current conception of Cabralism, or rather, Cabralist critical theory and praxis, evolved out of the 6th chapter of my book, Africa Critical Theory, which entitled Amical Cabrals Using a Weapon of Theory to Return to the Source of Revolutionary Decolonization and Revolutionary Re-Africanization. In Africa Critical Theory, I critically engage what I understood then to be Cabral's seminal contributions to the discourse of ongoing developments in Africana tradition of critical theory. As I was researching and writing that chapter, I developed an intense, perhaps I should say, even more intense affinity for Cabral's insurgent, intellectual, and radical political legacy. One that I have now come to conceive as a major turning point in my insurgent, intellectual, and radical political development. Cabral, it seemed to me, then it remains so how offers the African tradition, critical theory, not only radical political paradigms, but critical theoretical points of departure. C.L.R. James, Leon Gontran Damas, Aimé Césaire, Leopold Senghor, and above and beyond the aforementioned and more along the lofty lines of W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon. Amical Cabral, in his shamefully short, although incredibly remarkable life, also contributed to virtual treasure troves and innovated insights, critical theories, and revolutionary praxes that extend far beyond the borders and boundaries of the critique of racism, colonialism, and capitalism, and consciously developed dialectical discourses on democratic socialism, revolutionary nationalism, and revolutionary humanism, and an anti-imperialist interest of wretched of the earth as well. When Cabral critiques of racism, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, Eurocentric Marxism, Africa socialism, and African nationalism are brought into the ever-widening orbits of African critical theory, which is to say that when Cabral's discourse on cultural imperialism, cultural racism, religious racism, racial violence, racial colonization, extreme capitalist economic exploitation, and what it means to really and truly be and become a human. Although thoroughly radicalized and colonized, are analyzed for their contribution to the discursive deepening and ongoing development of the African tradition of critical theory. Something unprecedented in the annals of Africana intellectual history happens. 5 distinct stages of Cabral study arise, or rather 5 distinct conceptions of Cabralism emerge. The first conception of Cabralism was represented by the various appraisals and applications of as well as reaction to Cabral's critical theory of radicals, liberals, and conservative during the last decades of his life, roughly between 1962 and 1972. Some of the more memorable works of the initial stage of Cabral studies was contributed by Adriano Ajari, 1962, Gerard Chanlidi, I can't say it, William Zetterman, Ramonia Leddy, Reynold Chilcote, Basil Davison, Justin Veree, David Andelman, Bruno Crema, and Iliano Lucas, Bernard Megaban, can't say it, Bruno Crimi, and Cruz Pinto, among others. The second conception of Cabralism was grounded and grew out of several posthumously published biographical works of Cabral by Antonio I can't say it name. Ogled Ignatiev, I can't say it, Anqueno de Borgaques, Amarino Veri, and Mario de Andrade, among others. Although the varying qualities of ideological orientation, each of these works provide a first wave of Cabralists with insight into Cabral's life, intellectual evolution, and unique revolutionary practice based on the distinction historicity, I can't say it. I'm gonna look it up. I don't know. They say he's I don't know. Democratic socialist. They say that he's Marxist.
A little bit, you're reading really, really fast. And you're missing words.
How can you not correct it? Historicity, historical activity, factual existence, and authenticity of a person, event, or narrative. And cultural specificity of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. In many ways, the critical biographical works of Cabral published in the immediate aftermath of his assassination in January 1973 set the tone for the subsequent stage of Cabral's studies by often interweaving his biography with makeshift multidisciplinary discussions of his unique relationship with many of the major theories of political praxis of his epoch, from African nationalism, African socialism to Marxist-Leninism and Third Worldism. The third conception of Cabralism centers on the significance of Cabral's work for social theory and political practice, with major contributions being offered by, oh my gosh, I'm not going through all these names, a lot of people that I cannot pronounce, and the present author of Concepts of Cabralism, among others. These works collectively demonstrate the distinctiveness of Cabral's radical political theory and praxis, while simultaneously intimating the ways in which
We had it intimating.
Yeah, the ways in which his work has import for history, geography, sociology, anthropology, economics, political science, agricultural science, and military science, among other disciplines. Fourth conception of Cabralism involves around the rise of studies treating Cabral's contribution to African literature and what has become to be called the African Resistance. Renaissance. Got it. With work by Eugene Perkins, Gerald Moser, Russell Hamilton, Mayu Weiss Vambu, and Adid Zaghidi. Maurice Vambu, Monica Rector, and Richard Vernon being among the most noteworthy. From his earlier interest in the Cabo Verdeño movimento, avid reading of Clara Dadi and Cartazia, an affinity with the aesthetic of poetics of both the negritude movements and the, I'm not saying that word, movements. It can be said that similar to W.E.B. Du Bois, C.R. James, Leon Damas, Cesar Marat, Cesar, Lero Singord, and Frantz Fanon, Cabral had a lifelong love affair with that Eugene Perkins, termed the literature of combat, in his pioneering works. Perkins observed that although often overlooked, many of the leaders of African liberation movements are themselves poets whose work have served as empirical testimonies to the nature of African liberation struggles. For example, he importantly continued, Saque Touré, Amilcar Cabral, Eduardo Mondlane, Marcelion dos Santos, Augusto Neto, and even Patrice Lumumba are but a few examples of African liberation leaders who have also gained recognition as poets, Rather or not, this correlation of poetic skills and political advocacy is by circumstance or because of some other unexplained relationship. It cannot say, but it is interesting to note that so many African liberation leaders are poets whose dedication to the struggle is reflected by both their words and deeds. Indeed, Cabral can be situated with the African liberation leaders' poet politico paradigm. Although most Cabral studies scholars have given little or no attention to Cabral's poetry or poetics, as Gerard Moser asserts in his groundbreaking quote, "The Poet, Amilcar Cabral." Amilcar Cabral is universally known as the most successful of all leaders in African struggles for independence from Portuguese colonial rule during the 1960s and 1970s. However, only a few persons who had been his classmates or his close associations in African studies groups knew until recently that this man of action was also a poet. In 1978, 5 years after his assassination, most published 10 of Cabral's poems written between 1945 and 1946 there are to say the last breathtakingly beautiful and provided Cabralists with a rare glimpse into the emotional and intellectual landscape of the young Cabral, who was already questioning and becoming increasingly critical of Portuguese colonialism and racism. Consequently, as with almost every open major figure in the African tradition of critical theory, Cabral critical theory and radical politics are, however, loosely linked to his poetics and broader concern with African aesthetics and culture. The fifth and final stage of Cabral's study consists of engagement with Cabral's thought in the interest of developing African studies in general, and African philosophy in particular. The purpose of the fifth conception of Cabralism is neither to deify nor demonize Cabral, but instead to dispassionately explore the ways in which his life and legacy contributed to the discursive formation and discursive practice of African studies. Major works that fall within the fifth stage include, oh my gosh, a whole bunch of other people, I'm sorry, among others. A core characteristics of the work within the fifth stage of Cabral studies is that even in books or articles where Cabral's name is prominent in the title, the overreaching intellectual agenda is essentially aimed at contributing to African studies. In the most general, albeit critical sense of the term, it is therefore with this in mind that I openly acknowledge that my conception of an articulation of Cabralism, or rather Cabralist critical theory, is deeply rooted and indecidedly grows out of the fifth stage of Cabral studies. However, it is doubly distinguished from other engagements of Cabral's thought and text, that is, the collective works of all five conceptions of Cabralism, in that may conceptions and articulation of Cabralism is the first and cautiously examined his contributions to African studies and critical theory, or rather the Africana tradition of critical theory. To state it outright, my conception and articulation of Cabralism identifies and analyzes Cabral's contributions to the deconstruction and reconstruction of African study, radical politics, and critical social theory in the interests of the wretched of the earth of the 21st century, in highlighting Cabral's unique solution to the problems of racism, colonialism, capitalism, Marxism, Leninism, nationalism, and humanism. I reiterate 5 distinct concepts of Cabralism materialized, which enable us to intensely interpret the ways in which much of his work remains quite relevant in efforts aimed at revealing the wretchedness of the wretched of the earth of the 21st century, and deconstruct and reconstructing in reconstructing Africana studies, radical politics, and critical social theory in their anti-imperialist interest. In my Cabral studies, when I understand myself to be in critical dialogue with Cabral's, earnestly ask his corpus critical questions and seek from its crucial answers, which also means that I have made up my mind to work with and through Cabral in my ongoing quest to search for viable solutions to every increasing problems of racism, colonialism, capitalism, Marxism, Leninism, nationalism, and humanism. My Cabral studies, in short, keep with Cabral's own predilections for connecting critical theory to revolutionary practice by utilizing his thought and text as paradigms and points of departure to deepen the further development in Africana traditions and critical theory. What has long bothered me about the 5 stages of Cabral studies, and one of the main reasons I duly decide to research and write on Cabral, is a long-standing tendency to downplay and diminish Cabral's contribution to African studies, or the dim-witted disposition that seems to always and everywhere sever Cabral from African studies, or worst of all, the inclination to render Africana studies utterly invisible or altogether non-existent. Immediately after admitting all of this, however, I want to make it perfectly clear that I do not in any way wish to fall into a continued prickly practice of what the Caribbean American philosopher Lewis Gordon has correctly called disciplinary decadencies of his own words. Disciplinary decadency is an ontologizing. I don't know what this. It's ontological, but it's ontologinizing. I hear it. ontologizing. Of course, it's not converting the abstract concepts. Okay, hold on. Pronunciation. Of course, I have to do another thing. No, I will not do a survey. Ontologized. Ontologize and reunification of a discipline. In such an attitude, we treat our discipline as though it was never born and has always existed and will never change, or in some case die. More than immortal, it is eternal, yet as something that came into being, it lives in such an attitude as a monstrosity, as an instance of a human creation that can never die. Such a perspective brings with it a special fallacy. Thus, its assertion as absolute eventually leads to no room for other disciplinary perspectives, the result of which it is the rejection of them or not being one's own. Thus, if one's discipline has foreclosed the question of its scope, all that is left for it is a form of applied work. Such work militates against things. What is in question here are the borders and boundaries of disciplinary knowledge, and the ways in which many, if not most, academicians have repeatedly and unrepentantly rejected discipline transcending, or rather transdisciplinary knowledge. That is to say, knowledge which transcends, and traverses disciplines or specific fields of scholarly inquiry. This is also, I should add, symptomatic of what we could call epistemic closure, where one is only open to or seriously engages knowledge emanating from their respective disciplines or field, and in the most closed mind and catastrophic manner imaginable, xenophobically considered knowledge from outside or their discipline or field pure, fully foreign foolishness, as it were. Continuing his groundbreaking discourse on disciplinary decadency, Gordon importantly concludes, disciplinary decadency, as we have seen, is the process of critical decay within the field or discipline. In such instances, the proponent ontologize his or her discipline far beyond its scope. Thus, the decadent scientist criticizes the humanities for not being scientific. A decadent literary scholar criticizes scientists and social sciences for not being literary or textual. A decadent social scientist sins in two directions: by criticizing either the humanities or not being social scientific, or social science for not being scientific in accord with, say, physics or biology. And of course, the decadent historian criticizes all that for not being historical. The decadent philosopher criticizes all for not being philosophical. The public dimensions of evidence is here subordinated by the discipline or fields functioning literally as the world. Thus, although another discipline or field may offer evidence to the contrary, it could literally be ignored simply on the basis of not being the point of view of one's discipline or field. When I registered my complaints concerning the fact that many, if not most, of the works of the 5 stages of Cabral's studies have consistently, either at best, overlooked Cabral's contribution to African studies, or at worst, rendered his contributions to African studies in and of themselves invisible or entirely non-existent. I am not putting into practice that awful ideology or foul perspective that, quote, brings with it a special fallacy that Gordon touched on above. Quite the contrary. I am pointing to something altogether different, something a little more exclusive or subtle, that has seemed to slip through the cracks and crevices of the scholarship on Cabral. This, therefore, is not a simple case of disciplinary decadency, where I incorrigibly argue that, quote, my discipline is better than yours ignoramus. You ignoramus. Oh, I don't know if I can say that. Sorry, everybody. And where the sanctimoniously, I'm gonna hear it. I think I said it right the first time. I'm gonna hear it.
Sanctimoniously.
Believe in my discipline and the end of all and be all, or rather the definitive, quote, last word in terms of human studies. What I wish to do here is circumvent the very trite tendency to read, or rather misread, Cabral in reductive disciplinary terms, where his thoughts is validated and legitimate only insofar as it can be ruggishly reframed and or forced to fit into arbitrary and artificial academic confines of this or that decadent discipline. Employing African critical theory as an epistemological, methodological, and praxeological framework, my Cabral study seeks to consciously avoid the decadent disciplinary approach, or rather approach to Cabral in favor of a more philosophically flexible and epistemological open human scientific reinterpretation of his thought and text in light of his key crises and conundrums confronting the wretched of the earth, radical politics, critical social theory, in the first quarter of the 21st century. From the African critical theoretical frame of reference, it is full-heartedly and completely fallacious to criticize or condemn a theorist because his or his ideas and or actions do not fit nicely and neatly into the, again, arbitrary and artificial academic categories and conceptual confines of one's respective, or rather, irrespective decadent discipline. Cabral was not simply a, quote, military strategist or philosopher or revolutionary, but even more, he was an extremely innovative and complex organic intellectual activist whose intellectual history, making dialectical discourse appropriated and wide range of epistemic resources, rather from the social sciences or the humanities or the life worlds and life struggles of the wretched of the earth at his disposal. And these epistemic resources, however unorthodox, became integral parts of his ever-evolving weapon of theory and intellectual arsenal, without any regard whatsoever for the arbitrary and artificial academic and disciplinary borders and boundaries of Europe's insidious ivory towers and the apartheid-like absurdities of the American Academy. It is in this sense, then, I argue that Cabral can be considered a transdisciplinary critical social theorist, and that he contributed the weapon of critical theory to the African tradition of critical theory in particular, and the wider world of critical theory more broadly speaking. Furthermore, it is also in bearing the foregoing in mind that I remind my readers that when viewed from a epistemically open African critical theoretical framework, Cabral's thoughts and actions, however critical and radical, are not found to be faultless, and that he therefore is not presented throughout my work as a pristine and preeminent critical theorist of the 20th, or let it be solemnly said, 21st century. I honestly believe that what we, that is to say, Africana and other critical theorists, need is to critically return to Cabral as opposed to Eurocentric vulgar Marxists, bourgeois feminists, and postmodernist and post-colonialist interpretations, or rather often mind-blowing misinterpretations of Cabral's thoughts and text. If racial colonialism continues to be perfectly pathological, sorely sadistic, and viciously violent, as I understand it to be, and as I have argued that it is in all of my work, then we need we need the insurgent intellectual and radical political sources of what remains one of the most profound and provocative critiques and confrontations of not simply racial colonialism, but also of the ways in which racism and colonialism incessantly overlap, interlock, and intersect with capitalism, Marxism, nationalism, third worldism, and even more ironically, humanism, that which acutely occurs throughout the passionate pages of Cabral, or Our People, Our Mountains, Revolution in Guinea, Return to the Source, Unity and Struggle, the present volume. It is for these seemingly forgotten reasons that my Cabral studies not only advocate that authentic Cabralist critical return to Cabral, but that I sincerely seek to assent the fact that many of Cabral's most famous, if not infamous, theories are more relevant now than they were during his lifetime. For instance, Cabral's theory of the socio-pathological impact of the simultaneous racialization and colonization of the wretched of the earth. His theory of the interconnections and inextricability of colonialism and capitalism. His dialectical theory of cultural racism and cultural imperialism, his theory of the dialectic of the revolutionary decolonization of revolutionary re-Africanization, and his theory of the dialectic of revolutionary nationalism and revolutionary humanism are undoubtedly more needed now than ever before, and especially with regard to the dialectical deconstruction of and reconstruction of African studies, radical politics, and critical social theory in an anti-imperialist interest of the wretched of the earth. In the pages to follow, Woods makes the original contributions to Cabralism by highlighting how Cabral's analysis of a few types of resistance and the quote the role of culture in the struggle for independence both translate and publish in the present volume turns Cabral's attention to the hitherto unknown or otherwise unengaged aspect of Cabral's critical theory, namely, 1. His critical genealogy and dismantling of colonial regimes of historical presentation. 2. His critique of religion on both colonial and anti-colonial politics. And lastly, 3. His revolutionary anti-colonial misology, and how do you say that word?
Synonym.
I did it right. Of ecology, which according to Woods signifies the attempt to understand the relations of living things and to their environments. Radical colonial capitalist pathology is not simply, as Jürgens Habermas and the Habermasians critical theorists would have it, quote, colonization of our life worlds by the capitalist system. Although capitalism is most certainly an important aspect of such a pathology, but it also includes the overlapping, interlocking, and intersecting system of violence, exploitation, and oppression in the gillful guises of racism and colonialism as well. It is here then that the Africana critical theoretical reinterpretation of Cabral critically returns to Cabral's thought and text and intensely emphasizes that African studies, distinct, transdisciplinary human scientific research, methods and modes of analysis may have, or rather indeed do have much to offer the as too late frequently studied field of Cabral studies. In most of my books, especially Africana theoretical theory against epistemic apartheid forms of phenonism, concepts of Cabralism, and negritude movement, I have discussed my conception of African studies, and it therefore need not be rehearsed here. However, it will be important to elaborate on how my articulation of African studies circumvent the disciplinary decadence discussed above. On a deeper, perhaps even more discursively dangerous level, I am saying, first and foremost, that African studies is not a discipline, but rather a transdisciplinary human science that rejects the rules of epistemic apartheid of the European and European American ivory towers of academia. Secondly, African studies on principles deems those academics and or academic disciplines that do not critically dialogue with or leave, quote, no room for other disciplinary perspectives, end quote, or human sciences, and upholders, or rather, downpressers, to use Peter Tosh terms, Torres terms. Tercy. Is it Tercy? I don't know. Hold on a second.
Tosh's terse term.
I said Teraposh, I think.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's Peter Tosh's terse term.
His epistemic apartheid and extremely intellectually insular academic enterprises that, quote, discipline and punishment, to use Michael Foucault's famous phrase, intellectual insurgency and intellectual innovation in the anti-imperialist interests of the wretched of the earth. And finally, utilizing its own distinct critical theoretical framework, that is to say, Africana critical theory. Africana studies, sidesteps, and sullenly challenges the lazy line of illogic and ideological, and or a prior repudiates the intellectual insurgents and intellectual innovations from other disciplines because they are not, quote, one's own, with its unique emphasis on epistemic openness as opposed to epistemic closure, which is precisely the issue that Gordon's conception of disciplinary decadence identifies, exposed, and if truth be told, ingenuously eulogizes above. All right, hold on a second. I'm gonna look ahead. Oh, it's only 45 minutes. I'm gonna look ahead real quick. Can I add a bookmark? I wonder if they're gonna let me add a bookmark. It will. Okay, 31. Let me go see. I wanna look ahead. Okay, there's that one. Oh my gosh, this is a long chapter. Okay.
It's coming up quickly. It'd be better to end sooner than later.
39. 39. What number am I on? 38? 31?
1.
Yeah, that's a long way from there. Okay. Cabral has been half-heartedly hailed as a philosopher, sociologist, political scientist, African nationalist, Marxist, and military strategist, but never as a transdisciplinary critical social theorist with concrete radical political commitments, not simply to eradicating the wretchedness of the wretched of the earth, revolutionary decolonization, and revolutionary democratic socialism, but also to the multicultural, I hate when they keep saying democratic socialist, they said he's a Marxist, but also the multicultural masses, transthetic, working classes, and revolutionary humanism. He has been regularly praised and criticized by legions of scholars who have interpreted and rigorously reinterpret his work, often overlooking its deep critical theoretical dimensions, partly because African critical theory does not in each and every instance epistemologically and methodologically mirror Eurocentric, including Frankfurt School, concept of critical theory. In fact, Africana critical theory is most often at odds with Eurocentric conceptions of critical theory, and, much like Cabral's thought, hinges on the high level of insurgent intellectual independence and compromising commitment to the wretched of the earth. This, of course, is readily apparent in the pages to follow when Woods, in the most full-throated manner imaginable, asserts that Cabral's unique occupation of so many subject positions, student diplomat, organic intellectuals, poets, ergonomists, I can't say that right, general secretary, revolutionary, and so forth, give rise to a critical discourse and praxis that performantly puts into question the limits of white armchair critical theory. Consequently, here Cabral's multifarious and ever-evolving critical social theory is situated at the center and examined concepts of Cabralism for its significance for contemporary African studies, radical political thought, and revolutionary social movements. I simply could not agree with Wood more than he strongly stresses that the flexibility of Cabral's concepts, his translations of the problems and strategies of anti-colonial politics between peasants and diplomats, and his connection of other via Vietnamese and Algerian anti-imperialist struggles with those in West Africa, suggest that one should adopt a similar, malleable, theoretical, discursive openness to the critique of society and imperialism, while rethinking critical theory alongside Cabral. If nothing else, resistance and decolonization is a humble 21st century effort aimed at rethinking critical theory alongside Cabral. And I know it's 10 minutes early, but I'm going to stop there. At African critical theory, Cabral's critical theory of national history, national culture, and national liberation. And that is on 32.
Okay, so I still understand how, he's been called a Marxist by himself and others, but this isn't Cabral talking. This is some other guy talking about Cabral.
Okay.
So, he may have read it as differently than what Cabral himself said.
Well, we're going to find out, aren't we?
I hope so. I hope Cabral's writing's actually in here, because so far it hasn't been.
Well, that's because it's the introduction.
No, we're on chapter 1.
Introduction was chapter 1. Look. Go back up. Let me go back up. I don't know. I don't agree with the third worldism. I've never agreed with that position. Honestly. Let me see here. Yeah, part 1, Americo Cabral and the critical theory, the weapons of critical theory, blah, blah, blah. And then we're going to go to analysis of the type of resistance. So we'll find out. It's not a big book. It's the first book I've ever read by on a person named Americo Cabral. So we have other things to go through, and they're all small. It's not like he came out with huge theories and stuff, I don't think. Based on what I've been seeing, but we'll find out. I mean, the only thing we can do is go through this and have our analysis of it,
Yeah.
So we all know that he mentioned that Americo Cabral is a Marxist, so he's a Marxist. So we'll find out. All right, then. Is anything else as we read on to this? We'll see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see what we learn.
Yeah. All right, everybody. I'll go ahead and close it out early today. Why not? And we'll start again tomorrow. This book is only 200 pages long, so we'll see. I'm going to do more research on him a little bit more, I think. And wait, let me see the beginning of this book. See here. Translated by Danny Wood, with the introduction by Rella Rebecca. I'm just looking at this real quick. I can't say names, man. When people put different words, it's like my freaking I think my what do you call it? My dyslexia is how do you put those two words? How do you put those two letters together and sound it out? It's completely blank. It's what do I do?
Yeah, well, I mean, not just that, but these are all names in different languages. And so we don't know what accent to put on the names unless we recognize the names.
Mm-hmm. All right, everybody. Like I said, my position on nationalism is like Fanon's position on it. It has, if it moves too right, it will divert into capitalist relations and bourgeois connections. So no matter what, I'm that. All right, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm sorry we didn't get you anything, Yusuf. I'm so sorry. Thank you for coming around, though,